want to say a special thank you in particular to Conexión Américas for their partnership in this event, specifically Renata Soto, who I will introduce to you next. Renata is the Executive Director of Conexión Américas, whose mission is to help Latino families realize their aspirations for social and economic advancement by promoting their integration into the Middle Tennessee community. In 2002, the founders of Conexión Américas, including Renata, teamed up with an existing small nonprofit group called the Hispanic Family Resource Center. This was exclusively dedicated to providing information and referral services on health-related matters. The merger allowed for the implementation of a holistic approach to helping Latino families. Renata has worked with us to help build a context for today's discussion and has given of her time and energy to partner with Lipscomb. So let's welcome Renata Soto.
Buenos dias. We are very excited to be here today. As Candice said, Conexión Américas is a nonprofit organization that was started in 2002, to promote the integration of Latino families in Middle Tennessee. And it's crucial to our understanding of integration as a two-way process that engages our community, our new arrivals that are trying to learn their way here in Nashville, the new customs, the new laws, the new ways in which we can prosper from the opportunities that this community present to us. But it's also a process that engages our host community in opening doors to us, not only to learn about us and work with us, but also in building a community that we all aspire to have. And so for Conexión Américas, our work is only half done if it's not without the partnership and the doors that are opened by institutions like by Lipscomb University. I know that for many of you, Lipscomb probably, and Dr. Lowry will be the first one to say, there was probably a very inward-looking organization a few years ago, and I don't know if I would be curious to say, you know, when was the first time that you came to Lipscomb, but I can tell you that my first time that I came here has been recent, and I know that we are here gathered not only because there's a lot of people at Lipscomb that are committed to opening its door, not only to students who want and should take opportunities in this institution of higher learning, but also the doors that Lipscomb is opening to the community at large. I am very proud of our partnership with Lipscomb because I think Lipscomb is understanding that a university of higher learning, the best classroom is our world, and the best classroom is our own community. And so by opening the doors to Conexión Américas, to Hispanic Achievers, to the other organizations that have benefited from the partnerships to bring students to this campus, is also opening the doors to the students to learn about Nashville and to learn about community engagement. I think that we all can say that this is attributed to the leadership that Dr. Randy Lowry have brought to this community. He is a newcomer himself. He came to Nashville a little bit less than 4 years ago, and I know that he would not appreciate if I introduce him by reading the long bio that you know will speak about his many accomplishments and the reasons why he's here, and we have a copy for you to certainly get familiar with all his accomplishments. I know that he will be more appreciative if I tell you how excited he is that this is one of those conversations of significance that Lipscomb is trying to engage in with our community, and addressing the demographic change and the challenges that that brings and the opportunities that that brings both to Lipscomb and to our community at large is probably one of the things where he will have his energy and where he will hope to see Lipscomb in many years, who he will see behind, and he will say that that's one of the greatest contributions of his leadership. I know that many of you have heard him speak, and I know that my first opportunity to hear him was a couple of years ago when he was addressing the Leadership Nashville class. And I can tell you that at that point, Dr. Lowry had only been here a little bit over than a year, maybe just over a year. And he was still speaking as an outsider and as a newcomer. By chance, that day, he talked to the Leadership Nashville class about diversity. And he was talking about how he saw this community, maybe sometimes in reference and in comparison to other communities where he had been. But what I remember more distinctly was how challenging he was to those of us sitting in that room about thinking of the deliberate options that we have when we think about Nashville becoming a more diverse community, and how deliberate we could be about the choices that we make to truly build an inclusive community, or how we could just let it happen and maybe look back in a few years and realize that we missed some key opportunities to really work with each other and build bridges between Native communities and newcomers. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome him to this podium, because I know that he's gonna challenge us. Those of us that are already in the business of opening doors are already here, and I'm sure that he's even gonna challenge us further on how we really need to deepen our commitment to that and what other ways we can work together to do that. So please welcome Dr. Randy Lowry.
Well, thank you so very, very much for your attendance, getting up early this morning and coming to Lipscomb University for what will be another one of what we call conversations of significance. We believe that one of the roles of an educational institution is to bring people together in productive conversation. That doesn't always occur in our communities other ways, but we're going to try to create conversations of significance, like we did several months ago, bringing healthcare leaders together, about 100 of them in this very room. As we did a few weeks ago, as we brought nonprofit organizational leaders, again, in this room. And in each of those conversations, like we hope today, we will challenge ourselves as we think about our community, a community that we love, a community that we have tremendous hope for, and as a community that needs our very, very best thinking. There are some that would suggest it is a bit ironic for Lipscomb University to be convening this conversation. If one goes back into a longer history, we probably would not have been the lighthouse in the city as it related to racial reconciliation. Some might wonder why now and why this institution. And really, I don't want to try to convince you of the value of who we are or the sincerity of this moment, other than to say, I think we will be judged most effectively not by our words, but by our works. And we would invite you to join with us as we seek in a humble way to be an instrument of reconciliation and peace in this community. I want to start by asking you if you'll go with me a long ways away to a very, very different culture, but go there with me for just a moment for a particular purpose and some words that perhaps will frame my comments to you. Travel, if you will, from here to Nairobi, Kenya, a trip I made a number of years ago when conflict was significant enough in a community there that we were called out of my past life, which was in the world of conflict management. Flew to London, spent a day there. From London, went on to Nairobi, arrived, and began working in a conflict that was significant enough in a church body that the president of the nation had said, if the conflict is not resolved, I will kick the church out of the country. They can do that kind of thing, I guess, in Kenya. We couldn't do it here. But the threat was large and the conflict was intense. And so with a team of about 12 people, we settled in day after day, 14, 15, 16-hour days, trying to figure out how to move these people from moments of tremendous conflict to some sense of at least a peaceful reconciliation. About the fourth or fifth day, I was absolutely exhausted. The rooms were filled with people talking. I just needed some time away. I needed to think for a moment. And so I walked out in the lobby, and I sat down on a bench. And the bench there was open when I sat down, but then an elderly Kenyan gentleman walked up and sat next to me. Now, I would assume that he had very little education. He was not dressed in a way that would be particularly sophisticated. My sense was that while he did not have the markings we would think of as someone to really listen to, I just had the sense as he sat down next to me, I'd better pay attention. Oh, he'd been involved in some of the conflict. He'd been involved in many of the conversations. And he sat down next to me and he said two things that I will never forget. He sat down and he said, well, you know, you Americans, he said, you know, you deal with conflict differently than we Kenyans do. I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. He said, you Americans, he said, for us, conflict is like a field, and the conflict would be represented by the weeds that are growing up. He said, you Americans, he said, you know, when you see weeds in the field, you just buy new topsoil and bring it in and spread it over all those weeds and think that you have prepared for the future. We Kenyans know before that field is going to be productive, you must pull the weeds. Now, that's pretty simple, but it's also very profound. And there is a sense that sometimes we would like to just brush over the difficult stuff, bring the new topsoil in, spread it around, and pretend like everything's okay, and yet somewhere deep within us we know at times we have to do the very hard work of weed pulling. And then I sat there a little bit longer, and he said something else that made no sense to me at the time. He said, you know, you need to help us get this conflict resolved because we need to walk together. I didn't understand that. I had arrived from Southern California where I drove a $30,000 car on 10-lane freeways, drove 40 or 50,000 miles a year, and I didn't understand what it meant to walk together. But 2 or 3 days later, as I was still working in that community, we took a ride in a Jeep across Nairobi, and I realized what he meant. Because there were cars on the road, but there were hundreds and thousands of people on the same roads walking. And I think he had a sense that there was somewhere out there a journey, and if the two people on the journey were reconciled with each other, they could enjoy the journey, walk side by side, encourage each other along the way. But if the two people were in conflict, well, at least in that culture, one would walk ahead and one would walk behind, and the journey would be very, very different. Now, I know that illustration is not taken from a Hispanic culture. That's taken us all the way to Africa and back, and yet, might not there be an application of those two messages? Before we can plant the field, before we can expect what will be productive to occur, sometimes you have to do some weed pulling. And that's hard work. But then when the weeds are pulled and the field is planted and all of a sudden the new crop comes up, you realize that work was worth it. And in a culture like his culture, walking together had great significance. And I believe walking together has great significance in this culture as well. Perhaps it won't be as literal, but it certainly can be as real. I want to share with you just 3 comments this morning as you get started that perhaps will frame your day, perhaps be the tapestry on which your conversation takes place, perhaps be the outside edges of what will be a growing conversation in this particular city. But I need you to understand that as I share with you these relatively simple ideas, I think, I'm doing it from a particular perspective, and you are entitled to know what that is. So let me share with you just a little bit about the 2 people that are standing in front of you. One of the people that stands in front of you today is a middle-aged man. I say that because I intend to live to be 114 years old. A middle-aged white guy, in fact, who's not from here. A guy who's fairly well educated with a graduate degree in public administration and a law degree, whose profession is that of a lawyer and a law professor, who recently arrived in Nashville, who leads an emerging, I think, university, and who remembers fondly, especially today, that he should have paid more attention to Mr. Espinosa in the 7th grade. Because Mr. Espinosa tried to teach me Spanish. And in the 7th grade, I didn't pay near enough attention. And so today I come with a humility and embarrassment that I cannot communicate with you in what is your language. He's also a guy that doesn't pretend to be an expert, not even on what I'm saying this morning. But sometimes we throw ideas out, and as imperfect as they are, other people take them and make them better. And if you would compliment me in that way today, it would be a great blessing. But the other boy who is up here is a boy who attended Crafton Elementary School in Redlands, California. A third of his classmates, as he grew up in every one of his schools, were, as we described them, Mexican, because in fact they were from Mexico. My best friend in the second grade was a young boy by the name of Emmett Rodriguez. Emmett was the smartest boy in our class. I don't know enough about Emmett that I remember, except that he only got new clothes once a year and only got a haircut when school got started. And I would guess back there behind all of that were some things I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand in terms of his place and his involvement in our community and his family. But I'll never forget, he was the smartest of all the children in our class. I'm also the son of a mother who was raised in Oklahoma, moved to California, and for 35 years taught school, third grade, in a town called Colton, California. 95% of all the students in her class for 35 years were young Mexican children. And while I wouldn't pretend that my mother didn't come from the Midwest and the South with her set of biases and prejudices, I don't know that she ever understood any of them were different. And she embraced them, and for 35 years I remember going to her school, or going to get shoes, or going to get glasses, or doing things related to food, because they were not only her students, they were part of her family. And she taught long enough that she had generations of the same family, and devoted her life, perhaps not even as overtly and intentionally as I might think, but devoted her life to them. And then when I was a senior in high school, I worked at a store called Levine's Menswear. It was about the size of half of this room. It was a small little men's store in a relatively small town. There were two Jewish owners. There was an Italian Catholic tailor, and there was always a white boy from the Church of Christ who was hired in his senior year to work in that store. It was a cross-cultural environment before I understood what that meant. And there would be Friday nights no one would come in. We just weren't that busy. And the $200 suits in 1970 would hang on the rack. But I noticed after a while that there were people that came in, Mexican people from our community, who would only come in and buy blue jeans. They wouldn't look at the shirts. You couldn't sell them underwear. The suits were not of any interest at all, but they came in and bought blue jeans. And I asked the old man one time, 75-year-old Jewish clothier from that kind of mold in Southern California, I said, how come we have so many Mexicans that buy blue jeans? And he really didn't want to tell me. I had to explore, but then I learned. During the really tough times after World War II, Mr. Levine would sell blue jeans on credit. And there was an entire population that needed to buy blue jeans on credit. And now, several generations later, they kept coming. Not because they were probably the cheapest jeans in town, but because he had so solidified a relationship that that's where they bought their blue jeans. And so that framework, or that tapestry, like your life, is a tapestry that says, from that, what are the questions we should be wrestling with? From that is the motivation for my leading this institution into important community conversations. From that is my sense of trying to emanate, as I would seek to be a Christian, the person who thought and acted on his impulses of justice and sacrificial service and inclusion. And that's the reason we've invited you today. Let me ask three questions that perhaps you can think about during the day. They're obviously set in the context of a community that is changing. In my world, if there is something that's completely obvious, lawyers say we need to make sure that we take judicial notice of that. Judicial notice is just that thing a judge does that says, we can argue about this all day, but it's so obvious to me, I'm going to take judicial notice of it. That means it is real, it is a fact, it is reality, the reality we will deal with. And I think the reality is, and we need to take judicial notice of a fact, that Nashville as a community has changed, Nashville as a community is changing, and Nashville as a community will continue to change. And one of the ways that it is changing, and it will never ever go back to what it was, is this sense of being a cross-cultural community. You know the statistics. 1 out of every 7 people here was born not just outside of Nashville or outside of Tennessee, but outside the United States. You know the 80 or 90 languages that are spoken in our schools. You know the definable ethnic neighborhoods that are emerging, and the list could go on, but it would be a challenge for anyone to say something has not happened, something is not happening, and something will not happen. And so with all of that taken as reality, what are questions we might be asking? Let me just suggest 3 of them. One of them comes from that speech I gave 2 years ago that I think is continually relevant. 2 of them come from thinking that late last night really seemed profound. And I will let you know if early this morning it seems nearly as profound. But the first one, are we going to live lives clustered in separate communities, or are we going to open the door to lives of connectedness? And I began sharing this with the reality of where I live. I live on Franklin Road, and the reality is, as I go to my supermarket, it's about a mile north in the Melrose area on 8th Avenue, and when I go there at 10 o'clock at night, there probably will not be another white person in the store. If I go east a couple of miles, I'm at Nolensville Road. And while I feel excited because there's food that has a Mexican and Spanish influence, and it reminds me of home, I realize I don't speak the language, and some of them don't speak mine. And then if I go west, I go to the Green Hills Mall, and I feel like I'm in Orange County, California, and the reality is, one in Nashville can choose where one goes. And one can live a life that is completely segregated, or one can choose to live a life that is full of the cultural influence and blessing the city does offer. But as I said before, that really is a choice. And the reality is our focus there will make a difference in how we choose to live a life. And I'm not really saying when I talk about that you should necessarily live your life differently. But what I do think is true is that every one of us will make a decision, and every one of those out there that are not in here will make a decision. What kind of life do we want to live in Nashville? Do we want it to be narrow and segregated and without those stretching experiences that happen cross-culturally? Or do we want to say we live in a community where all of that is offered to us, and we will go to whatever extent and work as hard as we have to work to enrich our lives with that diversity? And frankly, this one goes both ways. Because there are folks who live on Franklin Road that will decide if they go to Nolensville Road or not, but there also are people on Nolensville Road that will decide if they go to other parts of the city. And for each it will be difficult, but for each it has the potential of tremendous blessing. So we begin with kind of an attitude. We begin with kind of a definition of the world that we are going to define for ourselves and the world that we are going to live in. Second question, are we going to expand the limited resources of time and money on issues that confront us, or open the door to a dialogue on the interests that drive us? I'll say it one more time. Are we going to expand limited resources of time and money on issues that confront us, or open the door to dialogue on the interests that drive us? And the 2 key words are issues and interest. Yesterday, I was asked if I would talk about the elephant in the room. And I came up and looked around and didn't find any elephants in this room. But I was told there will be one. It's the I word, the whole world of immigration and all the stuff that's going on. And as I thought about last night, I said, I really have nothing to say about it. And then I began to think back in my former career as a mediator, and I began to realize that maybe the challenge with the immigration question is the same challenge I had as I sat down for 19 years with conflicting people on 6 continents in this world and listened to them tell me about their dispute. And as they would sit around the table, obviously everyone can't start and everyone can't talk at the same time, so I would turn to one side and I would say, you know, tell me how you view this conflict. And that person would go on for 30 or 40 minutes, maybe an hour, talking about the conflict they were involved in. And at the end of that, I always said something kind of like, well, you're right. I was trying to affirm the fact that they had a perspective, and I listened to it, and frankly, I was convinced, you're right. But then I went to the other side of the table, and I said, tell me your version of this. And they described it for 30 or 40 minutes, maybe an hour, and we got to the end of that, and they too were persuasive. And I would say, you're right. You have a perspective, you're passionate about it, you're right. And then they would stop me, and they would say, hold on just a second, you're the mediator here. You know, we can't both be right. And I said, you're right. No, there's no way. There's no way you can both be right. You're right. And that, I think, introduces a level of confusion to us. And I think in the immigration debate, the reality is, if we're really honest with ourselves and we sit down at a table, we might find right on both sides. We might find legitimate perspectives on both sides. We might find concerned people on both sides. We might find people who are driven by things they feel strongly about on both sides. You're right, but you can't both be right. Well, you can't both be right if what you're going to do is address it as an issue. Because sooner or later, certain kinds of decisions will have to be made that exclude people or include people, and government will go about the business of making those, and the reality is that kind of problem solving probably is not going to ever work very well. But what if? What if instead of dealing with the issue about what the next piece of legislation ought to be, we said, hold on a second, if they're both right, why don't we refocus our energy and refocus our effort not on the screaming that's taking place between the sides, but on what's actually driving those people, motivating them, causing them to feel so passionate about whatever it is we're talking about. And you say, oh, Professor, you know, you're going back to your ivory tower days. You must have been an academic, because that's not the real world we live in. And yet, there have been moments over time where that concept made a huge difference. Probably the most influential part of the presidency of Jimmy Carter was a moment where he brought together at Camp David 2 world leaders, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel. And here President Carter brings them together, and he naively believes that he can take people who have been warriors against each other all of their lives and figure out some way they and their nations can get along. Oh, who would have bet on it? And certainly in the first few days of that exercise, the press, the media was reporting the fact that this isn't going very well. Each side packed up to go home several times. But the reality is he hung in there for 13 days. And he did something that usually is not done in that setting, nor has it been done in the immigration debate in this setting. He said, don't tell me anymore what the issues are. I know you both want the Sinai Desert. Israel wants it, and Egypt wants it. I know you both want it so bad, you're willing to fight war after war after war over it. I know you as leaders grew up in your nations as warriors, became the leaders of those nations, and all of that passion and all of that anger is still focused on the other side. I know all of that. That's the issue. What's the interest? What's driving each of you? And boy, it was hard to find out. He had to take long walks out in the trees. Then he said to Menachem Begin from Israel, he said, you know, why is it so important? You know, it looks like kind of ugly desert land to me. Why is Israel so focused on having the Sinai Desert, and Menachem Begin said, Mr. Carter, it's a matter of our security. We have always needed some buffer zone between us and those Egyptians because they're always coming over and pestering us and threatening us. We're a new country. We've got to have a buffer zone. That's the Sinai Desert, and we will fight to the death to get it. Really? And then he goes out with Anwar Sadat and he says, President Sadat, why is this so important? And President Sadat said, don't you understand? We are a proud people. We are a people that have been here for a long, long time. And the Sinai Desert has always been something that we controlled, that we flew our flag over. For us, it's a matter of sovereignty. And we will fight to the end to achieve it. Interesting. See, we know what the issue is, who gets the Sinai Desert, but that was the first time someone had said, yeah, but what's driving this? What's motivating this? Can we get a different discussion going if we talk about it differently? And all of a sudden someone says security, someone says sovereignty. And within hours they had what we now call the Camp David Accords. It looks so simple. I mean, looking back on it, it looks simple. They essentially said, you know, Egypt, pull all your offensive military weapons out of the Sinai Desert. That gives Israel a sense of security, but you can fly as many flags as you want to. Nobody really cares. And as far as I know, there has not been a shot fired between those two nations since 1979. Now, what happened after 50 years of war, 13 days of work, and all of a sudden, between these people, there's an entirely new relationship? What would have caused their leaders to say, I will do the unthinkable. Now that we have the Camp David Agreement, I will visit your country as your guest. What would cause Anwar Sadat to have the courage that this agreement probably cost him his life as he was assassinated a short time later? What would cause that? Well, what caused that is instead of arguing about the issue, they begin to understand and work with the motivation of the people. And it seems to me that there might be a lesson there for us. As we scream at each other, as the noise is so loud, sometimes a mediator is called in and all we're asked to do is lower the noise. But the question in a book called Deep Justice in a Broken World is an appropriate question when the author says, what else is there besides screaming when we talk about race? See, if you go back to the reality, and I'm not a historian, but I think I'm right here, you go back to the problems in this city with the African American and white communities in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. There was no argument about immigration. In fact, it happened almost the opposite. Here are people that didn't want to come and were captured and forcibly brought to this country. So there was no argument like we're having about immigration today, and there were still all the same problems. People who are poor, people who need education, people who need to be integrated into a community, people who need to have opportunity. See, you can argue about immigration all day long and you won't solve a single one of those things when whatever legislation is passed, those will still exist for us. So do we want to spend our time and energy in the argument, or might we step back and say, hold on a second. Yeah, whatever the federal government does, it does, and I have passion, and it's important to me, but the reality is there are things that are even larger in terms of importance. And maybe if we go to that interest level, and maybe if we spend time there, we will be able to do something much more creative and much, much, much different. The difference between arguing over an issue and working like Jimmy Carter did on the interests. Third question, simply this: are we going to focus on politics or open the door to focus on people? Are we going to focus on politics, or are we going to open the door to focus on people? I don't have a platform from which to criticize those who labor so selflessly in government. I got a master's degree in public administration, understand something about the nature of their work, and I'm extraordinarily proud of the sacrifice they make to represent us in those forums. And most of the time, a financial sacrifice, certainly a family sacrifice, certainly the giving up of their public or their private lives kind of sacrifice. I mean, there is real sacrifice going on. So I don't want to criticize the people, but I do want to suggest to you our political system is absolutely broken. And it's absolutely broken because it's based on a model that is out of date. And the model is you argue as hard as you can argue, I'll argue as hard as I can argue, and we'll take a vote, and someone will win and someone will lose. And they will start tomorrow and do the same thing again. The problem with that is that those who lost yesterday still feel some of the irritation of that when they get ready to do something tomorrow. And this process that is adversarial in nature and competitive orientation oftentimes gets a bill passed but may not ever touch the problem that needs to be resolved. My son is here. John called me one time. He was working in Sacramento for a state legislator. He called me when I was teaching law at Pepperdine. He said, Dad, I'm working for, who was that? George Runner. Glad he remembers. I'm working for George Runner, he said, and I need an idea about some legislation. I said, John, I'm in Malibu. You're in Sacramento. I'm not waking up this morning thinking about legislation. He says, oh, Dad, come up with something. I said, well, John, I don't know what to come up with. He said, look, you just have to come up with something that will pass. I said, what? He said, we don't really care what it is. We just need to get something passed. He needs credit for having passed something. And my political science undergraduate degree kicked in. I thought, really? Is that the world we live in? You just need to pass something. And so I started thinking, you know, what is it that could pass? Because we got to get George Runner so he can go back to his district and say, look what I have done. But now think about that for just a second. Senator Alexander was here just a couple weeks ago, and he would walk into this room and have one of his aides bring 12 file cases that would go all the way to the ceiling to help us understand all of the rules that have been passed to govern institutions like this. Now, maybe some of those are necessary. Maybe sometimes we're out of line. But Senator Alexander thinks that kind of is ridiculous to put that burden on just because somebody came up with another idea and that legislation would pass. I come from California, where not long ago we had this wonderful piece of legislation that everybody agreed with. If a criminal does it 3 times, don't you think they should go away forever? And all the hands went up and all the voters voted for it. And now the state is going bankrupt because they have no way to even incarcerate all the people. The judges have no choice but to send that way. Great piece of legislation. We'd all think, yeah, that probably makes sense, until we thought about it a little bit more seriously. And the same thing is happening in our world of cross-cultural relationships. I read the Tennessean yesterday. Bill set languages for driver's test fails. Now, I am absolutely pondering and trying to understand this, because we have someone who I'm sure in a great moment of compassion and focus said we want to limit those who take a driver's test to those who can read the test in English, German, Korean, Japanese, or Spanish. So those will be the 5 languages. And if we can pass this piece of legislation so they can only take a test in 5 languages, we certainly will have resolved the immigration problem for the state of Tennessee. Well, one, I wonder, why did he include Spanish? I mean, I don't understand that one. And then I wonder, well, who's he trying to keep from driving? And I think it's the Chinese, frankly. And I don't know how many Chinese we have in Nashville, but it must be the Chinese, because they're the only ones whose language isn't on there. And I thought it was so fascinating. I hear someone that says, hold on a second, you know,
A retired police officer said, you know, this won't change current practice, and it'll do nothing to keep illegal immigrants off the roads. Then I read the very back of the article, kind of fascinating. Tennessean goes on to report that this is not going to pass, and the subcommittee is not going to send it on. And then someone, in perhaps a very insightful moment, concludes the article by quoting someone else in the legislature. The reason why we do these kinds of things, it makes us able to go home, tell our people we just passed a bill that makes it illegal to do that when it was already illegal to do that. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I'm trying to figure it out. And my sense is sometimes we get there. Because we just have to have another bill to do something, and they're not very well thought out. They're not very well reflective of our own people, but there's a sense there of saying maybe the focus here on politics makes sense, and I'm going to finally suggest it might not. Just because something will pass doesn't mean it's particularly helpful. See, I think there's something else that's harder for us to deal with, and so we default to that. But there's something else going on that perhaps is a little bit more profound. See, I think perhaps if our legislators, those that govern us and pass those pieces of legislation that influence our lives, if they somehow could move from their politics and their special interest and their need to go back and get votes and all of the things that sometimes have to motivate them, and think about the people they're trying to serve, we might have some really different outcomes. But some of that may not happen in the same place the same way. Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat were ready to go home. It was several days into Camp David. They were through with it. The negotiations had broken down. There was no way they could see finishing this successfully. And Jimmy Carter is absolutely despondent. You can read about it in his book. He says, I walked to the back of my little cottage at Camp David, and I looked out the screen porch across the way to where the cabin is with Menachem Begin and the cabin with Anwar Sadat. And he said, I had no other ideas. But I remembered something. I remembered that Menachem Begin, early in the conversation, said, Mr. President, before we leave, would you mind autographing some photographs of yourself that I can give to my grandchildren? I'd like to take back to Israel photographs that are autographed by the President of the United States, and sometime before we leave, would you do that? And so there in the quiet of that screened-in porch, the simplicity of that cabin, with absolutely no idea what else to do, he sat down at his desk and began to write notes on pictures of himself to Menachem Begin's grandchildren. And then he talks about how when he got that done, he put them in an envelope and walked across the way and knocked on the door of Menachem Begin's cabin. Now you understand the intensity here. These folks have about to be embarrassed worldwide. This has failed. It's not going to be successful. The tension's pretty high. Nobody really wants to talk to anybody at this moment. And here the President of the United States knocking on the door, and the door is opened by the Prime Minister of Israel. And Carter says, I looked at him and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I know that before you leave you wanted some pictures, and I've addressed these to each of your grandchildren. I want you to take them and take them home to them. And he says that he stood there in the doorway, and the Prime Minister of Israel began to cry. Tears began to flow down his face. Because he realized at that moment the negotiation was not for some political end. This negotiation was for the lives of his grandchildren. Tears flowed down his face. A few hours later, he said, maybe we can meet one more time. A few days later, we have the Camp David Accords. it seems to me that somewhere in all of the conversation and all of the noise and all of the advocacy, there is room for our legislature, for our Metro Council, for all of those institutions that we have created to stop screaming at each other long enough to think about the people they are trying to serve. And so I dreamed just a little bit last night. I don't know if it's rational or not, but I'd love to see the bill from our legislature that said, we are funding today the Davidson group in every county in Tennessee. Now, some of you don't know what that is. That's a simple program where leaders get together and say, I'll have lunch once a month with someone of a different ethnic background. Wouldn't that be an interesting piece of legislation? We, as your legislature, have funded the Davidson Group in every county in Tennessee. We anticipate this year there will be thousands of people who simply have lunch with somebody who looks and acts a little different. And we think somewhere in there will be the web of relationships that change our state. Or what if they passed a piece of legislation that said, you know, we are not sure that those who are among us in the legislature that are biased and prejudiced, those that reflect values we don't really have as a people, ought to get to do that just completely unfettered. And so what we will do is think about how we reflect values that are more appropriate. Or maybe a piece of legislation that says, hold on a second. What we want to do is recognize that one of the precious things we have in Tennessee is the possibility of cross-cultural competence. And so we are going to pass a piece of legislation that funds for every school in the state a brand new curriculum that says we're going to teach you how to read and how to write and how to do arithmetic, but you will not be educated in our state unless you are also cross-culturally competent. We don't know how to get there, but we're going to have to relate with each other somehow in order to. Why don't we start in the same second grade classroom where I met Emmett Rodriguez? But why don't we do it in a profound way, statewide? Why doesn't our legislature think about that? Well, there are a lot of other possibilities. But I think the point is simply, are we going to try to resolve this politically, or are we going to resolve this as people? I want to tell you just one last story that perhaps will underscore my hope and my belief. See, I think there is no hope at all if we think unity is uniformity. There's no hope at all. We will never be enough alike so that that likeness then allows us to live and work together. It just isn't going to happen. What might happen, though, is for us to recognize that our unity does not come from being alike, does not come from thinking alike or looking alike or dressing alike or speaking alike. Our unity comes from something that, again, is much stronger and much deeper and much more profound. Our unity, in fact, may come from our willingness to get off of our agenda and serve each other. What is the Hispanic community in Nashville doing to serve the rest of the Nashville community? What is the African American community in Nashville doing to serve the rest of the community? What's the Anglo and white community in Nashville doing to serve? Because there's something that happens in service to each other that will never happen in a piece of legislation. It bonds you differently. We send students on mission trips all over the world, some 20, 25 countries, and we have very, very little conflict when there are 15 students in a small village in Guatemala digging latrines for the people who live there. Conflict is virtually non-existent. Why? They're caught up in something. And their differences as students from 46 different states coming together for that particular humanitarian trip, they just don't matter anymore because something else is happening. So let me close with the story of Larry. You don't know Larry, and you probably may not even understand this context, but I'll try to make it so it works for you. I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota from Malibu, California. Can you imagine that one? There was 100 degrees difference in temperature getting on the plane and getting off the plane. Went to law school for 3 very long years in Minneapolis, where it was absolutely frigid for this guy from the sun. And we went to a little church in Minneapolis, and it was a small church, about 100 people, and Ron and I had gone to a Christian college, and so we were kind of enthusiastic about all of that, wanted to be of service to this church, and it was so small that our meager talent became fairly significant. And at our church fellowship, it's a little different. It's a pretty low church, if you think about it that way. So those of us who are not clergy could do lots of things. And so I would lead worship on a Sunday morning, and then there was a guy by the name of Larry that would come up to me and tell me how I didn't do it very well. Now, you may have someone like this in your life. I would work Saturday night getting ready to lead the musical part of worship, and he'd come up to me, and afterwards he'd say, well, Randy, that was okay, but it wasn't near as good as it could be. And I said, well, okay, you know, I'm a law student working full-time, trying to volunteer my time here, but thank you, Larry, I'll try to do it better next week. So next week I'd teach a Bible class, and he'd come up and say, well, you know, you had some good thoughts there, but they really weren't, you know, the right focus coming out of that scripture. I said, okay, Larry, well, I'll try to study better next week, and maybe I can be better. And so this kind of went on, and I finally figured out what my church life had turned into. It was go to church, visit with Larry. And it happened all the time. Sunday morning, Sunday night, go to church, visit with Larry. Larry always had some way to encourage me, always some way to suggest I could do it better, always some way to be a little bit critical, and frankly, I was getting kind of tired of that. Because I'm just a young kid trying to get through law school, work full-time, go to this church and be of some service, and every single time I went, whatever I did, Larry needed to come see me. Well, during this time, Rhonda became pregnant with John, actually, and we're trying now to go to law school, work full-time, and get a baby here, and John was not real cooperative. Rhonda was in the hospital several times, had to be take injections every 4 hours for several months. I mean, it was a hard, hard pregnancy. One day, it's a Monday afternoon, and I get home from work, and I'm tired, and I got to study all night and go to class the next day, and Ron and I are there. It's about 4:30 in the afternoon, and there's a knock on the door. I didn't know who that might be. I went to the door, opened the door up, and guess who it was? It was Larry. He's now making house calls. Can you imagine? It's Larry standing there. And I'm thinking, you know, Lord, I tried to be good. I tried twice yesterday to do it right on Sunday. I had to talk to Larry. Why are you sending him on Monday? There's Larry. But he's standing there holding a big tray. His wife is standing behind him. On the big tray were pots and pans. And Larry said words that I'll never forget. Larry said, Randy, I know you kids are having a tough time. I know it's hard to get the baby here. You're working awfully hard. I didn't have to work today, so I stayed home and cooked dinner for you. I wonder if we could come in and share it with you. In that moment, our relationship forever changed. Not because Larry and I would agree on anything. And if we both get to heaven and we have a conversation, you know, I'll share whatever I think, and Larry will say, let me help you with that. I mean, he still will not be pleased. Uniformity is not unity. It's not going to happen that way. There's got to be something deeper and more profound, and I think one piece of it is our willingness to serve each other. 3 questions. I hope somehow they give you a sense of the tapestry of this ongoing dialogue. I thank you so much for being here this morning.
I would give you a long list of Karl Dean's accomplishments. You do have a bio in front of you. But what I truly want to say is he is looking out for so many interests and so many of the interests that are dear to the heart of Lipscomb and of the city. We are very, very pleased to have Mayor Karl Dean with us, and I know he's on a tight schedule, so I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Dean. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here, and it's always good to come to Lipscomb. And I want to say a particular thanks to Randy Lowry for his leadership and his commitment to really all of Nashville, and he has done so much, whether it's in the area of environment or creating dialogue amongst communities, just a great citizen. So Randy, thank you for all that you do. The topics that we're discussing here today are important, and the way I look at it really is that these are the things that we talk about with every part of the city. I mean, the issues that I think the Hispanic community in Nashville is concerned about are the same things that I talk about every day, that I talked about when I was running for mayor, the things that I say, the three pitches I have to hit every day, which are education, public safety, and economic development. I mean, those are the concerns, I think, of all citizens of Nashville. And in the area of education, we are committed to ensuring high-quality education to all of our students. I mean, education to me, in terms of its importance, it's an economic issue, it's a moral issue, and it's a civil rights issue. The Hispanic population is now 13% of our student body. It is the largest percentage in the state of Tennessee. And Nashville is also the home to the largest number of English language learners, which is approximately 11% of our school enrollment. I've had the opportunity to hold a town hall meeting at Glencliff where we talked about some of these issues. And the questions I got at Glencliff, no surprise to anyone, I think, would be the same questions I get at every other school that I've appeared at. Questions about how parents can make sure that their kids are getting the education they need, how they can help to make sure their kids get a chance to go to college, and their concerns about the status of public education in Nashville. And I've talked about this a lot in terms of what I see as the stars aligning and a real opportunity for this city to make progress with public education. As you all know, we are in the 5th year of not meeting the standards under No Child Left Behind. We're in what's called Restructuring 1, which is severe sanctions where essentially the state has an active role in the management of our schools on a day-to-day basis. If we do not meet the standards this summer, we'll fall into what's called Restructuring 2, where there will be, really the state will make a decision as how our schools will be governed, a fundamental issue. All right, that sounds like bad news, and it's a challenge. But what we've got in this community, which has been more apparent to me since I've been mayor, is we've got a huge number of people in our community, be it parents, be it business leaders, be it civic leaders, who are focused on getting schools right. Our city is blessed in so many ways. We are just on the verge, I think, of being one of the great cities in this country, and we can get there if we get the school issue right. And people get that, and they want to see us get it right. So this is a time where we need to be bold, where we need to be visionary, and we need to be taking aggressive steps. And the things that I'm interested in, you've heard me talk about teacher recruitment and retention. I mean, obviously, we've made some progress with the new teachers program, with Teach for America. We need to stick at it. I mean, fundamentally, what happens in the classrooms comes down to the teachers. And the teachers we have here are great, but we need to be aggressive about how we recruit. We need to be bringing in the very best for our kids. We need to look at school choice. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of going to the legislature and talking about charter schools with the education committee up there. I mean, that is not a panacea, but it's one of the things we need to have in our toolbox. I mean, if you go around and look at the different cities in the United States who have made real progress in education over the last 5 to 10 years, charter schools are part of the equation. And we need to send the message that we're open to that innovation. And there are folks who are eager to come to Tennessee, nonprofits, people who want to come here for the best of all reasons and help, will do so if we get our laws where they need to be. And President Obama, when he spoke to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce about 6 weeks ago, my favorite speech by the president so far, he said, he's talking about education reform, and he said, states that have charter laws that are basically don't work because of caps and limits on enrollment, you need to change those laws. And it's pretty powerful when the President of the United States says that. And we should listen. I mean, I'm sitting in my office, and maybe I'm going crazy. I'm thinking he's talking to me. But he's talking to all of us. And, you know, the President made a big decision when he appointed Arnie Duncan, who was the superintendent of schools in Chicago, a real reformer, to be the Secretary of Education. He sent a message. He sent a message that the status quo is not working. We need to embrace reform. And so I'm very pleased that of what the President has said, and hopefully we can follow along with what he is encouraging us to do. That's education. The other area that I talk about a lot is public safety. And I'm not going to, the chief is here to speak, and he'll talk about some of the accomplishments the police department has made in the past few months. But first, let me congratulate him. He is a grandfather today. But the good news is this, I mean, in terms of public safety, crime is down for the 5th consecutive year. And going into the 6th year, crime is already down, and that's going to be hard to keep that up. But we have made a commitment to have a fully staffed police department. We have the first fully staffed police department over the last 5 years. We get this accomplished in the last 18 months by hiring 100 police officers. The chief has an aggressive plan that I fully support to look at funding through the federal government for the COPS program. It's something we'll have to pick up, but down the road I think it's something that we need to do. We're very proud of the fact that the police department has been recognized by the Vera Institute of Justice as having a model program for other cities to follow in terms of community outreach to the Hispanic population and others in the community. We had a very successful event at Coleman Park just recently, community outreach that I was at and the chief was at, and I thought it was a phenomenal success, and hopefully we'll duplicate that. In the area of economic development, didn't get a lot of attention, but we have our first sister city in Latin America now, in Argentina, Mendoza, which if you're gonna pick a sister city, one that is the wine capital of Argentina is not a bad one to pick. But the other thing I think that's important is our recognition of the importance of small business to Nashville. The city wants to do whatever it can do to make it easier for small and locally owned businesses to prosper. And the city passed, with the full support of the Metro Council, the the non-discrimination program, which essentially is opening up our procurement process. And the idea is that small businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses need to have an opportunity to compete for government work. We have had, before I became mayor, there were a couple disparity studies done that showed evidence of discriminatory barriers. I thought, and the council clearly thought, we've had enough studies, let's just get something done. We've got this program up and running, and I'm optimistic that it will begin to show results. You know, the government can't do everything in this area, but we can at least, in what we control, try to create a level playing field, try to make sure that everybody in Nashville who is here has a chance to get this government work. I need to mention the defeat of English only in January. That was, I think, a great moment for the city. I love this city, and I'm proud of the city every day. I do think we are one of the great cities in the United States. I think we have a great future, and our best days are still ahead of us. But I probably have not been as proud as that night. And I think there was almost a collective sense of relief the next day, whether people were opponents or proponents of that measure, that the city just dodged a bullet. But my pride is we are the only large city in America that has been tested like that, the only large city. And we can say we passed that test, and we passed it overwhelmingly. And we passed it because we are what we say we are. We are a friendly city. We are a city that celebrates diversity. We are a city with its eyes on the future. Bob Dylan has a line where he says, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying. And great cities, which we are cities that are constantly reinventing themselves, being energized by new people, and that's what we got going here. And we got it going in ways that other places don't have it. We got it going because people move here from all over the world. We got it because people from all over the country move here. We got it because we have the music industry, which is based upon the creative talents of people. Their capital is their ability to play music or to create a song. I mean, what a great thing that is. We got it because we have great universities like Lipscomb. We got it because we care. And that was all reflected in that vote. And so that was a great moment for everyone in Nashville, and I am very, very proud of our city. I'd like to give a few minutes to Dr. Paul to speak to you all. Last night, the state of Tennessee confirmed that we have our first probable case of the influenza strain that has been in the news recently. A resident of Williamson County who attends a private school here in Davidson County had that diagnosis, and apparently the child is doing well. This was not unexpected news. I mean, clearly, you've been following what's been going on. This was something that we anticipated. Before we heard this news, the city had put plans into place to activate our Emergency Operations Center. We met again this morning. All relevant metro departments are working in coordination to make sure we stay in contact with the state and federal government and communicate information to our residents. Right now, the most important thing for everybody to understand is that this flu is preventable, it's treatable, and it's curable. And the message that I would like to relay to everyone is be prepared, don't be scared. Dr. Paul will give you some more specific information on how this one case was identified and what we need to be doing as a community. But when Dr. Paul and I were meeting this morning, we talked about the need to reach out to the entire city and to community leaders and how we could get that done. And I said, well, doctor, I'm going to Lipscomb at 10, and there'll be a lot of really important people in the audience, and this would be a good opportunity for you to perhaps talk on it. So let me turn it over to Dr. Paul and thank him for changing his schedule around. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Dean. I'll just take a few minutes because I know you're not gathered here to hear about the flu. But yes, the news from last night is that we do have our first case and Tennessee's first case of the 2009 H1N1 flu. Now, they're going to hear different names. You're going to hear swine flu and what have you. Just in a nutshell, it's a kind of a flu virus that's new for us. It's a new virus in town, basically. And it's the type of flu virus it is one that usually affects pigs. But this particular outbreak doesn't have anything to do with pigs. It's behaving, and this is a little bit of good news, it's behaving pretty much like regular old seasonal flu that we have. So we're really glad to hear that this one student that has the reported case is doing well. The illness that he had wasn't anything particularly worrisome or exotic. He stayed home for a couple days and he's getting better. Because this is a new virus, we need to take it seriously. People are concerned about it. And CDC, the Federal Centers for Disease Control, as well as the State Health Department, are really recommending that we treat these kinds of situations with caution right now. So because of that one case, the recommendation's been that students will be dismissed from the school for a week. This has a big impact this time of year on schools because they also have events planned and big events that are canceled. But we think it's the best thing to do to limit the spread of the virus among people. And also it gives us some time to investigate and see if there are additional cases within the school, make sure that people have been evaluated, and really do everything we can to stop the spread of the virus in that particular school. We're not surprised by this. You know there are other cities that are facing exactly this. There are quite a number of schools around the country that are dismissing students for a week while they investigate cases of this new flu. So at this stage, we're taking it in stride, but we're also really ramping up. And as the mayor said, the mayor opened up all of the resources of Metro government to be working together on preventing or lessening the impact of this flu in this community. And just a couple of things that are really important for us right now. One is making sure that we're communicating with medical providers so that they know what to look for and know how to get tests done. but also I think really most important, and this is where everyone in the whole community can help out, is getting the message out of things that everyone can do to protect themselves and lessen their chances of getting the flu. And this will be a familiar message. I hope it's a familiar message, but we're going to say it again and again and again about how to protect yourself from respiratory infection, and that's cover your cough, keep your hands clean, wash your hands very frequently. You got to teach your kids to do that. Keep your kids out of school if your kids are sick. Stay home from work if you're sick. If you develop an illness that you're concerned about, don't run out. If you just have a little runny nose, don't run out to the doctor or the emergency room. But if you have an illness that you're concerned about, call the doctor. So I think that the basics of keeping your hands clean, covering your cough, staying home if you're sick, are things that we really want to be spreading far and wide. And as the mayor indicated, and I'm sure the chief will talk about this as well, El Protector has been working with us to get posters and information out in a lot of different channels and venues. We want to use every network that we have available to reach neighborhoods, reach communities with basic messages about what people can do to protect themselves. We have a public information hotline number, and this will become more obvious in the news as we go on throughout the day and throughout the week. The number is 340-7775, and that has information in English and Spanish, basic information about what's going on, basic information, like I told you, about how to protect yourself, stay home if you're sick, and then there's a nurse available on that line for people who have specific questions. So there's a lot of work going on. Certainly all of Metro government is helping to get the word out into the community, and we appreciate any help that you can through your networks and your organizations. So with that, I will stop. I see Mr. Negri coming in. Mm-hmm. Any what? Oh. We're conscious of the concerns that there's been a big outbreak of this particular virus in Mexico, and so many of the cases that we see are people who have gone on spring break in Mexico, coming back. I mean, our basic message is this is a virus, and this is a virus that's here. And viruses don't really care what country people are in, or where they're going, or where they're coming from. This could have started here. This could have started here and gone to Mexico, and now it's coming back. Viruses are traveling around the globe all the time, and people are traveling around the globe all the time. And so I think it's important to realize that, the basic message about how to protect yourself applies to everybody, no matter where you are. And so, I think Mexico has more experience than we do with this particular virus at this point. We will make it through, and we will, as the mayor said, it's a great community. There's a lot of resources here. There's really good medical resources here, and we expect that we'll make it through this like we've made it through everything else. Thank you.
All right, I will now turn our discussion to Chief Serpas, who has a few words for us this morning.
Well, after the mayor and Dr. Paul, they got to be a lot fewer, because it's already 4:20, according to this clock right here. But I am very glad to be here, and certainly appreciate Dr. Lowry's leadership and Lipscomb's leadership in helping to bring together a dialogue about so many things in our community important, and this is just one of the many. The police department really does serve at the front line of so many things, and there's all types of opportunity for us to get better every day. We're very excited about being in our 6th consecutive year of crime reduction, but we're not done, and we still have a lot of work left, and there are still far too many neighborhoods in Nashville where people haven't either experienced the crime reduction that we've been able to achieve as a community and as a department and as a government, or places where we need to find new and innovative ways to reach across divides, be they language divide, be they ethnicity divide, be they community divide, be they religious divide. And one of the things that I can tell you that I'm tremendously proud of as one of our first outreach efforts was the Yell Protector program we created in 2005. And as the mayor said, in 2008, the Vera Institute of Justice, as directed by the United States Department of Justice, conducted an assessment around the country, 200 police departments that said they had some sort of an outreach program. And the long and short of it is they identified 6 police departments in America that should be looked at as a best practice for reaching out. And our police department was chosen as one of those 6 under the tremendous leadership of Commander Mike Alexander and his staff. So Mike, please stand up and introduce your 2 officers real quick. Thank you. But that's not enough. We don't stop just there. We don't say we got a great recognition and we're done. Just a couple weeks ago, Commander Alexander created an opportunity at a community fair to once again reach out in this particular instance to our community of Hispanic origin. And over 1,000 people came to that event. Over 1,000 people on their own with their children came to that event to interact with Mike and his staff. Still not enough. Commander Alexander will soon be announcing a teen police academy, and the first issue is going to be driven towards how can we find young Hispanic children, bring them to this teen academy, because we have to continue to expand our relationships, but more importantly, expand what the future of our police recruitment would be. We want to touch young people at an early age. And we don't just do it in one community. One of the things I'm probably the most proud of, is the 50 members of the clergy of Nashville who volunteer their time to be police chaplains. And many of these clergy members are from the African American church and the African American community. And what a tremendous opportunity for them and other members of the clergy to see police officers at the scene. To not see police officers as you might see on CSI, or not see police officers you might have read about in Joseph Wambaugh books, but to see police officers in 2009 who are touched and who never ever lose the sense that they're serving, and to have to be with these families at terrible times. These members of the clergy, and we have them from all of our faiths, we also have them from churches that are primarily African American, Caucasian, and Latino. And imagine how comforting it must be for these members of the clergy to see police officers without anything in front of them but what's happening. And to see that they're driven by service, and to see that they're driven to make a difference in people's lives. Yes, there's a quid pro quo, because what I want the clergy to do is to be able to go back to their congregations and say, you know what, something just happened last week in our neighborhood. But before we jump to conclusion on how the police responded, let's give them a chance, because I've seen how they've worked. So we constantly reach out. Think about what we do in our school system. The Metropolitan Nashville Police Department has 70 police officers who every day are assigned to our high schools and middle schools. Another opportunity to reach across to children and let them see police officers in a positive way, and in a way where maybe they'll think about joining our service one day, which to me is really about the most important thing. We have to continue to recruit. Now, I'll be honest with you. Despite all the great news in our community, and despite all the great news in our police department, and despite the national leadership role we play in so many things in Nashville Police Department, we are not recruiting as many people who are different as we want. And you know what? I'm going to be deadly honest with you here. I accept every responsibility of that as the police chief. I really do. But I'm also looking in this community and wondering how many of you are helping me. How many of you are telling your young people, hey, you know, you ought to think about being a police officer. So it's not just what we're going to do, but we need more and more people in the community to look up and say, I think being a police officer is a noble profession. I think it's the kind of work that will help me advance my career as well as my community. And we're open. Our doors are open. So we cannot recruit by ourselves. We've got to have other people helping us. And one final thing, because I know you're already late. We're never going to stop being the best that we can be. There is a fact of life in American policing. And the fact of life in American policing since the early 70s, we've known that about half of all crime goes unreported. So while we're very excited about the crimes we know about that are going down, we recognize that there is a significant amount of crime that goes on that we don't know anything about. That's what drives a lot of our community outreach. But I want to make sure that this is a crystal clear point. I'm not exactly sure why this is happening, but I do know, simple math, simple numbers. I do know that every year for the last 5 years, despite all the public consumption of information about everything going on with immigration, we have had more members of the Latino community call us for service every single year in the last 5 years. That, I think, is at least a good sign. I think that's at least a positive sign that at some level people are still willing to call their police department, and more numbers than they did before. But the caveat's clearly this. I know we're not getting every call from every community. I know that we're not getting every call from every race. I know we're not getting every call from every ethnicity. And that's our responsibility, to continue to reach out and find ways so that people will tell us what's going on in their neighborhoods. Quite honestly, I would rather report a 100% increase in crime if I knew we actually finally got every single crime counted. So until we get to that point, we have to continue to find ways for people to feel comfortable to call us and tell us what's going on. Give us the opportunity to serve, give us the opportunity to help, and give us the opportunity to better understand what's going on in our neighborhoods. This is a great opportunity here today. Once again, I want to thank President Lowry and Lipscomb for hosting this dialogue. And I'm a bit nervous because I'm going to see my grandson in a little while. I'm pretty pumped up about that. It's a great day in Nashville, and it's a great day in my family. Thank you very much.